It's a hall of mirrors, The
wild.
Justice Department under a Democratic president indicted a Democratic mayor of New York, and this crowd comes in and says they were weaponizing it.
Mind-blowing. So the Democratic-led DOJ indicts the Democratic governor, and that's weaponization. Well, one thing we need to learn is what MAGA accuses you of, they're doing.
Welcome, everyone. Delighted you could join us today. It's a bit of a grim day news-wise, and the only thing that makes it even close to tolerable is that I have as my guest, my dear friend, David French, New York Times columnist, and David, close your ears. I'm just going to praise you a little bit. I mean, just one of the most brilliant, but also humane and decent human beings in American life today. And, gosh, I wish we could clone him. Okay. Now, before we began, David, you and I were exchanging, exasperation doesn't quite cover it.
No.
Disgust about the fact that just across the wires this morning is the news that Trump, among the worthies that he thinks need his compassion and his attention in the world is Andrew Tate. That on top of the white South Africans, the Afrikaans people who he says have been very badly treated. Everybody else, he's perfectly happy to treat very badly, but those people gain his love. Andrew Tate, David.
Andrew Tate, set to stand trial in Romania for human trafficking and rape.
Yes.
Known, I mean, it's not controversial that he's a pornographer. I mean, that's, a key part of his fortune. In addition to his masculine influencing. I mean, if you're going to talk about people in the so-called manosphere, he wowould be the worst of them all.
Right.
The worst. Absolutely horrific.
The worst. And encouraging men to be, it's one thing to be, encouraging men to be proud of being men and to aspire to a kind of healthy masculinity. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about someone who is a rapist and encourages men to be like him.
Yeah, and
he's an accused rapist, I should say.
Accused, alleged.
Yes,
yeah,
alleged.
So
yes.
So not only is the guy in his personal life just horrific. Let's he's going to stand trial on the trafficking and rape charges. We'll see how that goes.
Right.
But what we definitely know about him, even aside from the trafficking and rape charges, is this man lives in the sewer.
Right.
And he...
No wonder Trump likes him.
Oh, yeah. And he just tweeted something, was it yesterday or today, where he was talking about how a man who has all of his children through only one woman is not winning or dominating at life.
Yeah.
There's nothing much good to say about this guy.
No. So that's the tone, that this administration sets. It is really like living through some kind of dystopian nightmare, that this is the world we're living in. And to further that theme, let's talk about what happened, at the Munich Security Conference, because everything is happening so fast. It is a bit like the title of that movie from a couple of years ago, Everything Everywhere All at Once. I mean, so many things are collapsing. But maybe most importantly, although the rule of law in America is one of them, and we'll get to that in a second. But, the Munich Security Conference has been going on for decades. It is an outgrowth of the American-led and American-created post-World War II rule of law international order, where we have allies and we stand for certain principles, which include democracy, self-determination, opposition to raw aggression. And our vice president travels to Munich. Munich, mind you, the scene of Chamberlain's shameful capitulation to Hitler. He travels to Munich and he doesn't say a word about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which is the topic on every European's lips. he chastises the Europeans for limiting the participation of the AfD in Germany. Germany is going to have an election in 2 weeks. AfD is getting more support than it ever has, thanks partly to another administration figure, Elon Musk. But in any event, he basically, our vice president went to Europe and announced that we are no longer on the side of democracies and of freedom. We are on the side of AfD and Putin.
You know, what's really weird about this, Mona, is I saw a lot of people online just absolutely cheering J.D. Vance for delivering, quote, hard truths or, you know, stern words to like the woke West, and specifically applauding J.D. Vance for taking the European powers to task over their rules regarding free speech. Now, I'm a free speech lawyer. I've been one my entire career. And I don't like some of Europe's rules regarding free speech. I do not.
I don't
Germany,
Right.
Great Britain, I don't like. But do you know who has far worse free speech rules? Russia. You know who has far worse? China. And to actually, when we're facing a war that is reaching a critical phase with hundreds of thousands of people dying, hundreds of thousands injured, millions displaced, and what we're going to really go to the wall about and to really just show those Europeans what for are free speech rules that are not ideal by any stretch, but so far, so many miles removed from the salient threat facing us right now.
Exactly.
You know, there's this phrase, you know, I learned growing up, don't major in the minors. Look, compared to armed aggression from an expansionist Russia, nuclear armed Russia, and compared to hundreds of thousands of people dying, the bad European free speech rules, you know what you can do about those? Fight those out in court, right? You can make those arguments in advanced Western democracies. You can make legal arguments in advanced Western democracies and have them be heard. But this is very consistent, Mona, with a theme that we've seen from day one of the Trump administration. Our friends are our enemies.
That's right.
And our enemies we're trying to turn into our friends.
That's exactly right.
It's flipping the whole world upside down. He's tough against Canada.
Yep.
And weak against Russia. He's tough against Mexico and standing in the gap to save TikTok, you know, one of Chinese propaganda instrument. I mean,
yeah. Oh, I mean, that's a whole other topic. I mean, the notion that you see among the MAGA faithful, which is just laughable, is, well, we have to sell out Ukraine and Europe because we need to focus on the real threat, which is China. And there is well, what do you think? I mean, you think they're going to be serious about Taiwan? You think they're going to be serious about taking on China?
Oh, I don't think they're going to be serious about Taiwan at all.
Right.
You know, look, there is, you know, the funny thing about this and where MAGA gets some of its juice, so to speak, is there's a way in which you can kind of squint and see an actual credible strategy. So, for example, you could say, let me sane wash it for just a minute so that, or steel man it, whatever.
Yeah.
You could say, look, Russia is a weak economy. It's basically a gas station with an army and a nuclear arsenal. Over in Western Europe, you have large advanced democracies like Britain, France, Germany, Poland is rearming at just this incredible rate that ideally we could shift some of our strategic investment from Europe, where we have partners who are very capable of ramping up their own military, and move some of that to the blind spot, which is the Far East, where we do have vulnerabilities, right? I could actually even get behind that strategy if that were the strategy.
Yes.
Okay. So in a functioning alliance, you go to Britain, France, Germany, and you say, we do not have infinite resources. We are still with you. We are with you in NATO all the way. But we're going to have to shift a carrier battle group or two to the Pacific. We're going to have to reorient our Marine Corps almost exclusively towards the Pacific. And you know what we're going to need you to do? We're going to need you, France, to build another aircraft carrier. We're going to need you, Britain, to have your Navy fully manned. You know, this is what partners and allies do. That's not what is happening. What is happening is he is picking fights with allies, sometimes, especially when it comes to Canada and Mexico, picking fights that could have massive consequences for the economy and well-being of these countries, including, and by the way, our own economy and our own well-being. Because, Mona, if you talk to somebody who's true MAGA, now I'm not talking median Republican, but like true MAGA, they really are more worried about what they would call the threat from within.
Well, I was just going to quote him because I was going that was, you know, your scenario, you know, where if they were serious, you know, it would play out that way. But of course, Vance gave away the game by what he said. He said, the threat I worry the most about vis-a-vis Europe is not Russia. It's not China. It's the threat from within. And so what he's really saying there, translation, I worry more about wokeness in Europe than I do about any invading army killing millions of people.
Right. And it really is where their hatreds lie.
Yes.
Okay. So because a lot of what we're dealing with, we just have to be honest, is hatred driven. Yeah. Where is the hatred here? Because MAGA is in many ways a very hatred motivated movement. And MAGA, you know what it reminds me of, Mona, and just bear with me for a minute. If you're talking about, because I'm very reluctant to go with the, you know, I don't want to do the rise of Hitler stuff. Like, I don't want to do that. But what it does remind me is in the interwar period when you had the brown shirts versus the red shirts. And this intense domestic fight that you're having between far right and far left factions in Western democracies. And I think that this is how they view the world, that essentially what you have in the wokesters or whatever are the red shirts, right? And the red shirts are the real enemies. And they would never claim this mantle, but they're the brown shirts, right? And the brown shirts are taking on the red shirts, and that's the real enemy. And you could see this, you see this in almost everything that they do. If you want to see somebody MAGA get very, very, very animated, talk about domestic opponents.
Yeah, exactly.
If you want to see MAGA's eyes glaze over or derisive laughter or whatever, talk about foreign enemies.
Right.
Now, they're very schizophrenic about China, but any other enemy other than China, talk about a foreign enemy and their eyes glaze over. Yep. You're a neocon warmonger.
Well, and the thing about China is that the thing they resent about China is that it has the effrontery to sell us things rather than it may stamp out, freedom in Taiwan. That doesn't trouble them at all. It's that they want to sell us, dishwashers. But anyway, let me come back to Ukraine for just a second, though, because what we're seeing in real time is something that I had an argument with a family member about this in the weeks before the election. This person was voting for Trump. And I said, you're voting to sell out Taiwan. And he said, oh, you say that, but that won't really happen. So let's just pay attention to what has happened. In addition to the Vance speech, we also had our Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, say that Ukraine's idea of holding on to its territory is unrealistic. And then you had Trump have a 90-minute call with Putin, who is a wanted war criminal, right, and invited him to come and visit the United States and wants to fold him back into the G7. This is the second time that Trump has done this for Putin. And let's recall that when Putin first rolled his tanks into Ukraine, Trump was swanning around Mar-a-Lago and pointing at the television cameras and saying, this is genius. This is brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, Mona, I never thought I would see this day because it is so much beyond we're both Cold War conservatives. We came up in the Cold War.
Absolutely.
And one of the reasons why I became a Republican is I thought the Democrats were not sufficiently aware of the Soviet threat. They were too naive about the Soviet threat and some of their own defense policies, some of their own efforts at détente, I thought were naive and dangerous.
Yep, me too.
But at no point did I get the feeling that the Democratic Party thought that the Soviets were our friends and NATO was really our enemy, right?
Right.
And that we had that was not part of it. It was always we were, there's this phrase that a lot of people use derisively now, but which we should actually look back on with pride. And that phrase is the post-war consensus. Mm-hmm. And the post-war consensus was one of the elements of the post-war consensus is that we needed collective security to prevent a World War III. Part of the post-war consensus was that the primary threat to democracy was the Soviet Union. All of these things were part of a consensus. Now, that did not mean we didn't have big fights about the best way to confront the Soviet Union. So, for example, the Vietnam War and domino theory was one of the most contentious elements of the entire Cold War. So when you say consensus, we don't want to overdo it. There were a lot of disagreements about strategies and tactics, but there was clarity in the big American mainstream about who our friends were and who our enemy was. There was a ton of clarity about that. And honestly, Mona, in the
Actually, it was Jimmy Carter who started the big military buildup after the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. Yeah,
exactly. Reagan continued it, but it began under Carter. I remember, that I was a young kid, but I was also a defense policy nerd at a very young age.
I'm sure you were.
Things like the rapid deployment force, and then, there were lots of efforts moving from Democrats to begin to bulk up American security in the late 1970s. Not enough. Mm-hmm. Reagan comes in, completes the task, so to speak. But in that post-war consensus, it wasn't that we were all in lockstep about everything. There were bitter fights. I remember them well. I
wrote a whole book about them.
Yes. But nobody in the big American mainstream, like you could go to, like I remember when I was in high school, I went to a summer program at the University of Kentucky, and one of my instructors wore a Sandinista uniform when he was. So there were these university radicals who were
absolutely
very sympathetic, but to the communists. But in the big American bulk of America, between the two parties, there was clarity on who our friends were and who our enemy was. And now that is detonating. It's just detonating.
And it's not even just an ideological thing because, so in the Reagan years, for example, it wasn't just that we were anti-communist. We perceived ourselves to be anti-authoritarian in all its guises. Now, we frequently made our peace with authoritarian regimes that were anti-communist, and it wasn't pure by any stretch. But we certainly understood that coups were wrong, that closing down opposition newspapers were wrong. We pressured our allies like the Philippines to hold elections and El Salvador to make space for civil society, etc. So those were all the things that I thought the country was in agreement on, that there was a certain consensus about the rule of law and about civil society and about rights and about all those things, and that it wasn't strictly a left-right issue. It was a human rights issue.
Well, and also, I would say over the Cold War, we made a lot of mistakes and we learned a lot of lessons. And so one of the lessons we learned related to the mistakes we made is we were always better at building partners. We were terrible at creating vassals. Mm-hmm. So, South Vietnam was a vassal for a while. We repeated this mistake with Afghanistan
and Iraq.
A vassal,
right?
A
little bit. Yeah.
So when we have vassals, it doesn't work out very well. When we have partners, it matters. And so, one of the ways, and you might say, well, what have these partners ever done for us? Well, I distinctly remember serving in Iraq next to Australian and British soldiers. They were performing. And this was Iraq. If you served in Afghanistan, you were covered up with the European allies who
Absolutely.
were there as part of their NATO obligation.
Because NATO Article 5 was invoked after 9/11.
Exactly. The Brits took real casualties in both Afghanistan and Iraq supporting us. I mean, allies matter. And this sort of idea that we have done all this on our own, we can do all of this on our own. Well, they say we can't do it all our own. So now we're going to do what? Nothing? It really is, Mona. I think we're moving into a far more dangerous moment than I thought we were going to be moving into, because what Xi and Putin are realizing, here is what if I want listeners to take one thing from what I say today, it's this. Do not think of Donald Trump as unpredictable. Think of Donald Trump as manipulable. And that's what our adversaries have learned. Russia, China, they have learned that they can manipulate him. They can use the fact that Trump admires authoritarianism. They can use the flattery. They can use this sort of desire to be seen as part of the strongman club. Because truth be told, I think Trump wants...
Well, that's the key thing, David. Yeah. It's not just that he's manipulable, if I may, because our Democratic allies were not successful in manipulating him. It's the strongmen who are, because he deeply, at some level, wants to be a member of that club. So they have an easier time encouraging him to come on over to the dark side. He's sort of there already.
Right. He sees himself as a world leader, like a Xi, like a Putin.
Yes.
That he sees himself, and as you see from the way he's running the government the second time, as somebody who can rule by decree.
Yes.
He is trying to replicate the way in which Xi or Putin governs their country. He's trying to replicate that into the United States. He's even replicating it in the way he approaches the justice system. I mean,
let's transition to that now, because we are seeing that. So, it is an amazing thing that this president has majorities in both houses of Congress. Remember them? And he has not proposed a single item of legislation, unless I've missed something. But he has attempted to rule by decree, executive orders, and one of the checks in our system is supposed to be the Congress. It's supposed to be the main check on presidential power. We've now seen that this Congress, because it's dominated by his party, is inert. Nevertheless, he doesn't even bother to go through the window dressing of asking for legislation, because he is keen to prove a point, namely that it's President über alles. That's it.
I mean, he's treating the U.S. Congress. Well, let me put it this way, because I'll say this: he is treating the U.S. Congress the way, say, a Putin would treat the Russian Parliament,
the Duma. Yeah,
it's just an extension of himself.
Right.
Now, what compounds the problem, though, is unlike with the Russian Parliament, Congress, to be treated like the Russian Parliament, has to agree to be treated like So
that's right.
Constitutionally, our Congress is more powerful than the president. As a matter of just pure constitutional law, our Congress is more powerful. So for Donald Trump to become a Vladimir Putin, he can only do it with congressional consent and to a lesser degree judicial consent, because the judiciary could throw itself in front of him and he could just drive over the judiciary.
Well, we got to get to that. Yeah.
Yeah. But so Congress, this is a cooperative effort.
Yes.
He is asserting himself and Congress is voluntarily withdrawing.
Yes.
And Mona, we just have to bring this back. I don't want to go all JVL on this podcast, but
I think we're all feeling that way.
It's our fault.
Yeah.
It's the American people wanted him again. And look, I've gone on and on about how many good folks voted for him without knowledge of all that he was. That's only a partial defense of them.
Yeah.
Because we do have an affirmative obligation to be informed citizens. And the idea that, people are so indifferent or tune out politics so much that they're just going to be the vessels for this out of apathy is only a very mild defense. At least it's not, intentional malice.
Yeah.
But, a democracy that dies through apathy and indifference or ignorance is just as dead as a democracy killed by malice.
Imagine a bunch of school board members had made a decision not to fire a teacher who was a known child abuser. And they'd all gotten together and they'd said, but I mean, yes, he does have his history of child abuse. And, we know that. And that's not good. But we have the worst performing science students in the county, and we desperately need him. He's such a great science teacher. I'm going to overlook the child abuse because we have this other priority. And that is kind of where the voters in the United States have been, which is, I know he's got his problems. He attempted a coup. He's a vicious and vindictive person, who will use the law to, protect his friends and attack his enemies. Yeah, that's all true. But, I didn't like the way Biden governed and they were too woke and prices were very high. So give power to this guy. And that's unforgivable. They rolled the dice and now we're in it. We are in a position where our whole world is being turned upside down. We don't know what the international order is going to look like. We've touched on that. Let's talk about though, and we know that the Congress is a dead letter, for now. That doesn't necessarily have to be permanent, but for now, because it requires the American people to wake up. But let's talk about the legal situation. So first of all, it is beyond argument, it seems to me, that many of the actions that this administration has been taking are not legal. Okay. Would you agree with that?
Yes. Oh,
okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
And many of them are already being enjoined.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So he's rolling over the law and basically daring the courts to try to stop him. And as we know, and it's been rehearsed many times, but one of the ways that J.D. Vance auditioned to be the vice presidential pick was by saying a couple of years ago that what Trump should do is fire all of the federal employees. And then when they get sued, say to and they go to the Supreme Court, say to the justices, who he said will rule against us. You've made your decision, now enforce it. So that's where we are. They are daring the courts to try to stop them. And so, David, I want us to consider now, I want to hear you on this. We don't know how the Supreme Court will rule on various challenges to these lawless actions. They may find excuses not to rule against Trump in the name of sort of preserving their, keeping their powder dry for the next big thing. Who knows? But, which, if that happens, then they have therefore sort of ratified his seizure of power. If they do challenge him and slap him down and say, you cannot do that, it violates the Constitution and the laws of the United States of America, and he disregards it, looking at the U.S. at the moment, looking across this country, do you see a picture of how anybody would say you have to obey the court and not defy it? Or do you think we would have the explainers and the whatabouters and the people who are just weak saying, oh, well?
See, the die is cast on the rationalization and justification for defying the court. I mean, this is already being implanted. You're already beginning to see some of these quote unquote explainers and podcasts in Magaverse that are trying to explain why the district courts actually don't have the authority to enjoin the president. Explain why Marbury versus Madison was wrongly decided, and so you're going to have people. It's very much like think of it like in terms of the election steal effort in 2020. So in 2020, what you had was a collection of whacked out conspiracy theories like Italian military satellites, North Korean bamboo, traces in ballots. Yep. So you had the whacked out conspiracy theories, but then you also had the legal theories, which in legal terms were whacked out as well. But because very few people know the law, all you have to do to sort of comfort MAGA is to get like a guy with a JD and some decent credentials, like say a John Eastman or whoever, just spout total nonsense that would never prevail in court and say, see, I'm operating under a rational, coherent legal theory. And MAGA goes, well, there we have it. And I just saw this again and again and again throughout Trump 1.0 was he would do something just whacked out. And next thing you know, you'd have an op-ed or two in, say, the Federalist or somewhere on townhall.com or somewhere, which is, if you know much about the law, if you practice law, if you understand how the judges operate and their judicial philosophy, you know these theories are just whack. And yet, that's all that's needed. That's all that's needed for people in, not just MAGA people, but for regular Republicans to go, oh, okay, this is just, the left has their theory and we have our theory. This is normal stuff. No, it's not normal stuff. And in many ways, what Trump is doing is he's really hitching a ride on our functioning, on the ingrained habits that we've had of thinking through political disputes, living in a functioning democracy where the two sides both have valid points and maybe one's more valid than another. But we're used to in this democracy for a very long time having a fight between two sides that have valid perspectives. Mm-hmm. Maybe one's more right than the other, but they're both credible. Mm-hmm. And so we're just used to that. And so we don't have a category for one person not having a valid legal argument. And so we're not accustomed to there being no real meaningful foundation for some of these theories. And the fact that you can sort of concoct one that sounds smart does not mean that it is smart. Sounding smart and being smart are not the same things.
That letter that Danielle Sassoon sent to the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, explaining why, in good conscience, she had to resign her post as ADA in New York. And when she was asked for spurious reasons to dismiss the lawsuit, the criminal case against Eric Adams, she went through the absurd arguments that the other side was making. Now, you can find this, but in other situations. But what struck me was that I was looking at perhaps, the final days of a real legal system functioning. And this is like a reminder of how it used to be. The fact is, I went to law school. I didn't like it. I really didn't like it. But I didn't like the parts that were like commercial law and all the aspects of law school that are about learning the trade. But I did come to appreciate the Anglo-American system of justice that has evolved over centuries and that has accommodated itself to all kinds of ways that individuals can be disadvantaged by the law and compensated for those. And that gives all of these rights to defendants so that they can't be railroaded by an out-of-control state. And all of that is so delicate and so beautiful. It's like a beautiful filigree but it's so easy to smash it. And so if we are now headed for a world where it is, the law is whatever Trump says it is, then you are destroying the work of, a millennium.
I had no idea, and I should have seen this, Mona. I had no idea, but I should have seen it. Because other people saw it going all the way back to the 18th century. I don't think we have any idea how much the pardon power can destabilize American democracy.
Oh, boy.
And so look at it like this. So, for example, I was sitting here thinking and trying to take some comfort from the fact that, Trump is there. When you lift up the rock on Trump 2.0 administration, you're going to see an enormous amount of corruption. You're going to see, in all likelihood, illegal activity. And, we're going to have an election, God willing, in 2028. And if Democrats win, you could see some accountability come down hard for some of the things that have happened during Trump 2.0. And so you think, well, shouldn't that be in the back of people's minds? Like, I'm not going to be in power forever. My team doesn't run things forever. This has always been a check on excess because there's another election coming. And
right.
whatever power I wield, my successor will wield. And that's always been one of the reasons why you've seen presidents incrementally push the envelope. We've had a pattern for a while of presidents kind of pushing, but Trump's jumping in with both feet.
Oh,
and so
a sledgehammer.
Yes, but the flaw in that accountability analysis is that at the end of his term, Trump can just excuse everyone. So whatever you do for him is going to be baptized by his pardon power. And so what that does mean in a very real way is we could very well see a period of lawlessness from the highest government, the highest office in the land, like raw lawlessness for which there can never be accountability. And
that's right.
And I should have seen this, but I had so it had been ingrained in me that American presidents possess a certain minimum level of decency. Because I don't remember the Nixon years. I was born in 1969. I was 5 when he stepped down. So I do have no memory of that. So the first president I actually remember is Jimmy Carter. And so not even Bill Clinton, who I believe was corrupt and should have been impeached and convicted, would be willing to wield power in the way that Trump has. And I look at Clinton as kind of the lowest character president of my adult lifetime. But he's miles from Trump in this. Yep. And so who saw this coming? The Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists saw this coming. And there's this just really chilling thing, a piece written by a guy who went under the pseudonym an Old Whig. And an Old Whig in a letter that nobody reads in America anymore, but they should start doing it, is that an Old Whig wrote in his letter number 5 that
this was in response to the Federalist Papers?
This is in response to the Federalists trying to get the 1787, the original Constitution, ratified. An Old Whig said, "It's too much. You've given him too much." And here's his quote. This is published on November 1, 1787. "The office of President of the United States appears to me to be clothed with such powers as are dangerous. To be the fountain of all honors in the United States, Commander-in-Chief of the Army, Navy, and Militia, with the power of making treaties and of granting pardons, and to be vested with an authority to put negative on all laws unless 2/3 of both houses shall persist in enacting it, and put their names down upon calling the yeas and nays, is in reality to be a king as much as a king of Great Britain." Now, I think he's overstating it there.
Yeah.
But notice how the pardon power is right in that analysis. And you're starting to see why now that pardon power can create a license for lawlessness. And we're seeing that unfold right now. Look at what happened with the January 6ers. Look at what's happening. But it's not just his personally loyal shock troops. He pardons Blagojevich for no good reason, except maybe Blagojevich was nice to him. Yeah. He's seeking benefits. Now, he doesn't have any power over Romania and the Tates, but he's using diplomatic pressure to give them benefits. And everything that's in common is, if you kiss up to me, you're good. If you don't, then watch out. And this is now unfolding at scale. And if you go back to 1787, the argument back to an Old Whig was a person and an institution. The institution was Congress, because Madison thought that Congress would be jealous of its own power and prerogatives. It has turned out in the most recent incarnation not to be. It now sees its own prestige and power linked to, or at least Republicans in Congress see their own prestige and power linked to supporting Trump, not exerting their own authority. But the other safeguard was the example of a person, George Washington. So George Washington steps into this office that only exists conceptually on a piece of paper, and he brings it to life in an example. This is what it means to be an American president. And Washington established a principle of restraint and integrity. He only served 2 terms. He could have served his whole life if he wanted to. Time and time again, he demonstrated forbearance and restraint, and he set a pattern for what the presidency should be like. And we remember the presidents negatively who step way out of that, like a Richard Nixon. But Donald Trump doesn't respect the example of George Washington. Congress doesn't respect its constitutional role. It's afraid of Donald Trump. And so here we are.
And in addition to extending his beneficence to people like Andrew Tate, he is what, the irony is that, there's always this projection. Whatever they do, they project onto others. This is something that Trump learned at the knees of Roy Cohn, and it's always, attack, attack, attack. And so they claim, they are weaponizing the government. They are weaponizing justice. Well, the fact is, immediately, Emil Bove, or Bove, I don't know how you pronounce it, but, who is Trump's literal lawyer, who is now at the Justice Department, is threatening the people who had the integrity to say, I will not weaponize the Justice Department for you. He is saying, we're going to investigate you.
Yeah.
And this is one of the most sinister aspects of this whole Trumpian phenomenon, is that they are constantly trying to invert, apparently this is something that abusers of women do, where they invert the victim and the oppressor.
Deflect, avoid,
Thank you.
Reverse
That's
victim offender. Yes.
Yeah, reverse victim offender. And that's what they're doing. They are saying they're going to investigate, the Republicans who had enough integrity to participate in the January 6th investigations. They're going to investigate people who had the integrity to resign rather than dismiss the case against a Democrat, by the way. I mean, it's a hall of mirrors,
It's
the
wild.
Justice Department under a Democratic president indicted a Democratic mayor of New York, and this crowd comes in and says they were weaponizing it.
Mind blowing. So the Democratic-led DOJ indicts the Democratic governor, and that's weaponization. Well, one thing we need to learn is what MAGA accuses you of, they're doing.
Absolutely.
I mean, this has been a consistent pattern. And by the way, the acronym DARVO is deny attack, reverse victim offender.
Okay.
I had to get that right. Yeah.
There. Okay. Yeah. So thank you for that. Yeah. Several years ago, I think it was in 2022, Trump bleated or whatever on Truth Social that, all rules, regulations, even the Constitution has to be abrogated to put me back in office, right? And there was one Republican that I counted who said, okay, that's a bridge too far, can never, ever support this person again. He's just called for abrogating the U.S. Constitution. That was John Bolton.
Yeah.
Nobody else commented. And so just 2 days ago, he bleats, he who saves his country does not violate any laws. It is as blatant as it can possibly get.
You know what this reminds me of, Mona? So I used to get really frustrated during the height of the war on terror because people would be writing these really long think pieces about why is it that Al-Qaeda does what it does? And they would come up with talks about, they would talk about colonialism, and they would talk about lack of economic opportunity in the Middle East, and they would go through all of this stuff. Meanwhile, Al-Qaeda is out there telling you why it's doing what it's doing constantly.
Exactly. Yeah.
And and at some point, do you actually listen to what they say they're doing? So this was especially true with ISIS. It was like, well, we think we're going to create a caliphate, and then the West is going to attack us, and we're going to defeat them in an Armageddon-like battle. And they're like, but what do they really believe? Maybe what they're telling you. I have this similar thing with Trump, where it's like, Trump says, set aside all the laws and rules, and people are going, what does he really mean?
Yeah.
Because there's this whole take him seriously, not literally.
Yeah, exactly.
What? Okay, so now, a month into this second term, we can realize that when he said, set aside all of this, all of this, all of this, he meant it. He meant it. And that when he tweets Napoleon and posts Napoleon's, words that have been attributed to Napoleon, he sees himself in that mold. Let's do Occam's razor here, guys. Maybe the guy says what he means. Now, I know he's sloppy with language and sometimes there's play in the joints, but
Yeah.
when he says the same thing so much, maybe he actually means it. And we don't need to sort of say, oh, he's not saying what he means. What he really means is much more benign than the words he constantly says.
So a minute ago, you were talking about how, but for the pardon power, it might be possible for the next administration to come in and provide some accountability, right?
Yeah.
But, in terms of where we are and how broken things are after 1 month, it seems to me the question is, how much damage will he do to this system? Will there be enough left by the end of this administration, or let's say in 2 years when there's a midterm, that it can be rolled back? Or are we really on a downward? Are we in a spiral here?
Here's what worries me, Mona, because I do think we can roll back a lot of negative things. I mean, if you look at sort of the reforms launched after Watergate, there was a lot of effort to say, okay, how did Nixon screw with our system so terribly? What can we do to close some of those loopholes? What can we do? So, and some
By
of
the
those
way,
things,
Nixon, I was around for Nixon. I was in high school. And let me just say, compared to Trump, he looks like a Boy Scout.
Right,
But anyway.
right. Yeah. But so after Nixon, there was this sort of wave of good government reform and everything.
Yeah.
Here's what I'm worried about more than, because we can pass laws, we can, enact constitutional amendments to close some of these loopholes. I would love to see the pardon power being stripped from the president.
I agree.
But here's what I'm more worried about. I'm more worried about us, the American people.
Yeah.
Because what he's also doing is he's fostering in his followers the same hatred that he feels. And so when I learned this, in 2016, I voted third party. In 2020, I voted third party. In 2024, I voted for the Democrat, for Kamala Harris. First time I ever voted for a Democrat for president in my life. And when I wrote about that, the blowback from ordinary people, like ordinary Republicans that I know, was really surprising to me, especially considering that they knew I hadn't voted for Trump in 2016 and 2020. But they had been so inculcated with this hyper-partisanship of Democrats as democrats and the dehumanization of their political opponents that they really saw me as joining the enemy of the country. Whereas if I'd voted third party again, they would view me as sitting out the fight. By voting for the Democrats, they viewed me as joining the other side. And it's that internal hatred that is the fuel for this fire. And that's what I'm more worried about than any specific action, because all of these actions are empowered by that hatred. And then Trump milks it and fuels it and fuels it. And so I don't know, Mona, what we do with all that hatred after Trump leaves the scene.
Learned hand, a quote that I loved for decades. Liberty, I'm going to get it slightly wrong, but it's something like, liberty lies in the hearts of men and women. If it dies there, no law, no constitution can save it.
Yep. And another, there's a number of ways to think about this, but a great way to think about it is it's very hard for liberty to survive hatred, because what possible incentive do you have to protect the rights, the dignity, the lives of people you hate? And that's where I feel like we're going.
Yeah. Okay. One more thing that I think you are most equipped to shed light on, because you mentioned that, the MAGA movement is fueled by hatred. It has its joyful, fun aspects to it. You've written about that internally.
Yes,
internally they have a lot of fun with themselves, but with one another, I should say. But so it is a constant refrain. There have been countless think pieces in the liberal press about how we haven't shown enough respect to Trump voters. We've shown contempt. We need to listen to them, and we need to show them that we don't despise them. And while I do think there are elements in, sort of the progressive world who do despise other people, I get more vibes of disdain and hatred from the MAGA people than I do from the progressives at the moment. What do you think?
Oh, yeah. I will tell you something, Mona, that is very sobering. So I grew up in evangelical conservatism. And one of the things that you feel deeply when you grow up in that community is that you feel like you're disliked and despised by elites. So you feel like the folks at the New York Times they look down on like a white Southern evangelical, or
right.
If you go to Harvard, then people will mock your faith or whatever. And there are elements of that out there. I'm not going to deny that there are. I've experienced them. I mean, I had a long legal career defending religious liberty, especially on college campuses, where there were contemptuous leftists, just contemptuous, would be happy to violate every one of your constitutional rights because they view you as a terrible human being. The far left is bad. And so I was spending a lot of time confronting that. And so this was all sort of feeding in that notion that, there are elites out there who really despise Christians. And then when I got on the wrong side of the Christian conservative world by not supporting Donald Trump, what I experienced was something worse than anything I'd experienced at the hands of the left. And I'd experienced some bad stuff at the hands of the left. And so then I began to hear the stories and when I got, my feed and when I got in mainstream media, I began to hear stories from people who had interacted with Christian conservatives, and the stories of hatred and vitriol and abuse were horrifying. And so, one of the things that I wish I could say is like, go back and go to these churches where they say, why are they looking down on us, and say, guys, you don't know what other people in the pews around you are saying and doing to your opponents. And if if you could walk a mile in their shoes, you would know this. You would know that if I cross the evangelical conservative movement, I can expect terrible things, terrible treatment, horrible treatment, threats. I can expect threats. I can expect intimidation. I can expect the worst kind of name calling and slander. And now most of the people in the pews don't participate this at all.
Of course.
But I've gotten to the point where the fact that you are sitting in institutions in which many, many, many of the members in good standing are abusing their fellow citizens, and you don't do anything about it, then that's not to your credit. Like, I'm going to give you credit for not participating in it. But when you're a part of a movement and you're part of an institution that is supposed to be following the person of Jesus Christ, and it doesn't alarm you when you hear of all of the abuse towards critics, etc., emanating from your own institutions, and that doesn't alarm you, that is very difficult to deal with, Mona. It's very difficult to deal with the fact that there's such indifference to the suffering that their own institution inflicts on its critics.
Yeah, I have to say my own personal experience. I know you have had you've had a very tough time at the hands of MAGA, much worse than most of us, including abuse about your daughter and all kinds of things. And I thankfully have not had that, but I will say it's kind of, it is illuminating. Somebody that I've always thought of myself as somebody who could get along with both sides. And, but when I used to go out speaking to conservative groups, they would always say, oh my goodness, you're so brave to say the things you say because they're out there and they must, be so horrible to you. And the fact is, I'd get a certain amount of hate mail, but, from people who disagreed with me, but I didn't get threats. I didn't get, abuse for the most part. Sometimes, but it was, it was small. But when I got on the wrong side of MAGA, it was off the charts. I mean, on Twitter in 2015 and 2016, that was when I first started getting the unbelievable misogynistic, anti-Semitic, all of that stuff, hatred aimed at me, the contempt that, and so I have a limited amount of sympathy for the people who are constantly saying how, we really need to understand that MAGA is just a reaction to the way they're being badly treated. I just.
Well, and look, I have enormous sympathy for a lot of the folks in the MAGA coalition who have fallen on hard times because of factories that have closed or stagnating economies, especially in the old industrial Midwest. Huge amount of sympathy for that. It's a very, very, very difficult question to figure out how to restore the kind of economy that a lot of folks grew comfortable with and worked for them. It's very difficult. That's a very difficult thing. But this sort of idea that a lot of people take so personally in their own lives, they're so personally offended in their own lives by the disdain like that the women's studies department at Oberlin might have for them.
I know.
When they have nothing to do with their life,
Exactly.
But I think what also happens, you have to realize a lot of the business model of right-wing media is to go find the most contemptuous leftist.
Yep.
And put them front and center and saying, look and see what they think of you.
Yes.
And they're not representative. They're not the normal person left of center. No. But it's all about sort of feeding the sense of grievance.
Yep. Well, we have quite so a friend of mine has an app that counts down the days of the Trump administration for him. I'm tempted. But I guess we should close on any thoughts about, what individuals can do at this moment. I get a lot of letters, I'm sure you do too, or emails from people saying, what do we do? I mean, obviously it's not a moment for thronging the streets, but what should people do who feel alarmed?
That's a great question. And I think if you go back and you look at how Donald Trump became president again, there's a couple of factors. One that is totally out of any normal person's control. And the other one that is, interestingly enough, a little bit in our control. So the one factor that is totally out of any normal person's control was there were failures of governance and misfortunes in the Biden term that made it more possible for Trump to come back. The inflation. Now, inflation was a universal phenomenon in the Western countries post-COVID because of pent-up demand. But there were things that the Biden administration did to make it worse. The border was a mess. The Afghan withdrawal was horrific. All of those things were outside of the control of the normal person, right? And they helped lay the groundwork for Trump's return. But Trump couldn't return without civic ignorance at mass scale. And so what you saw, if you looked at the data, was that amongst the people who are well informed about the news, Kamala Harris won those people pretty substantially.
Yeah.
Trump won people very substantially who got their news from nowhere at all.
Yes.
So one of the things that we can do is be ambassadors of truth, is that we can tell the truth. We can talk in our circles and our families. We can speak to our friends truthfully about what is happening, because anything that we can do to cut through the fog of confusion that MAGA intentionally creates, we're going to actually help. I'm using this phrase for a while based on the Isaac Asimov series Foundation, shorten the darkness. What can we do to shorten the darkness? And I think one of the things that we can do to shorten the darkness is speak the truth, be informed, and share what you know. Because right now we are dealing with what Donald Trump is doing is he's ruthlessly exploiting civic ignorance, and not just civic ignorance of our system itself, although he's exploiting that. He's exploiting the fact that Americans just don't follow the news at all. He's exploiting that ruthlessly. So he's creating this sense of energy and action that from a distance, people will go, wow, we've really elected somebody who's going in
Doing
and
something.
doing stuff, right?
Yeah.
So he's creating all this energy that if you're not connected to what he's actually doing can look impressive from a distance. But then when you know something about what he's doing and how stupid much of it is, much less corrupt, and then all of a sudden the to use a phrase from one of my old mentors in the practice of the law, he would say, the bloom is off the rose.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as you see what he's actually doing and how absurd it is, unless you're hardcore MAGA, the bloom is off the rose.
So, David, I'm sorry, can I keep you just for another minute? Because I want to pursue this for a sec. Because I get the feeling that a lot of people on the left and the center left haven't yet adjusted to the new information reality. That they think we're still living in a world where they can set the narrative, where they can tell the stories that will break through. And it's actually the other side that now has much more capacity to break through. And so they need to get more creative and inventive about communication strategies and even, whole new methods of communicating with the public. Cause, putting it on 60 Minutes is just not going to do it anymore.
Yeah. Well, part of the problem is the primacy of social media as a news source. And how do you adapt to that? Musk has figured out, and Trump and MAGA have figured out how to exploit it.
Yes.
Extremists have figured out how to exploit it because social media is extremely conducive to extremist messaging.
Yes.
Those of us who are not extremists have not quite figured out how to use that same medium to combat extremism. Because often the answer to the extreme assertion is something a bit more complicated and nuanced, which is tough to, but it happens to be true, much more true than the extreme assertion. So there is a lag. There is absolutely the case. And we saw this with the far left on Twitter, for example. The far left weaponized Twitter very effectively in the 2010s.
Yep.
The right has learned its lesson and then taken it to a whole nother level now.
Right.
So we've seen how extremists have mastered social media. We have not seen how the big American middle has mastered social media.
And we have to figure, that has to be our biggest job right now, is figuring out how to communicate better.
How do you reach people?
Yeah. All right. We will leave it there for now, David. So good to talk to you. Thank you so much for joining me.
It's my pleasure. Anytime.